Chris Hadfield said that on launch day, no astronaut takes to the skies with their fingers crossed. The way they've dealt with the stress induced by the risk is to picture the launch failing 1,000 times before the moment of truth actually arrives. If the imagined failure comes true, the result can reverberate in the public consciousness around the world, and the effects can be felt for decades. It can also attract attention that even the government is unsuccessful in hushing up. The disasters on this list have been arranged based on how many lives were lost and how preventable the disaster was judged to be. After you've watched this video, before you head to the comments, do note that we're leaving out Challenger here because we've talked about that in a previous video at length. The first entry has been included in the hope of beginning this list on a rather lighter note in order to ease our way into the more extreme cases. Number 10. Vanguard TV3. Victims? None. By the time the Vanguard TV3 launched, America had spent 2 months deeply embarrassed that the Soviet Union's Sputnik had been the first satellite to orbit the Earth. So the launch of America's answer was moved up from the spring of 1958 target to December 6, 1957. It was not only viewed by expectant throngs of onlookers at Cape Canaveral, Florida, but it was also broadcast on live TV. Thus, millions were able to see the shuttle fly roughly 1 meter into the air, then explode and fall over. It was perhaps the most embarrassing event in the history of the space race, with the Soviet Union making a point of offering the United States aid through the United Nations. Still, it said something about the can-do American spirit that Explorer 1 was successfully put into orbit by January 31st, 1958, just 2 months later. Preventability? The leading theory is that the explosion was caused by a fuel leak or insufficient fuel pump pressure. However true that is, it seems quite likely that moving the launch of a pioneering spacecraft up by months was bound to increase the chance of insufficient safety checks. Number 9. Soyuz 1. Victims: Colonel Vladimir Komarov. While Yuri Gagarin is celebrated for being the first man into space, his friend is remembered for being the first person to die returning from space. On April 23, 1967, Komarov's Soyuz 1, Union 1, entered orbit and then began to experience communication and power failures. These culminated in the parachutes needed for descent failing to deploy, ensuring that Komarov would die in a small inferno. American espionage listening in would claim that Komarov received messages from the Soviet premier along with his wife and children, yet transcripts would describe him as very humanly crying with rage as he fell. The corpse left behind would have been grotesquely charred, but he received an open casket state funeral, as if to illustrate just what the cost of failure would be for the Soviet Union's cosmonauts. Preventability? Well, there's some debate over this. In the biography of Yuri Gagarin, Starman, by Jamie Doran and Piers Bronzy, it was asserted Gagarin and a team of engineers inspected Soyuz 1 and found 203 structural flaws, recommending in an ignored memo that the launch be delayed. NPR would later report that there were a number of critics that attempted to debunk the existence of the memo. If the memo was real, it seems like this was an incredibly preventable tragedy. Number 8. Virgin Galactic's SpaceShipTwo. Victims: Michael Aylesbury, with Peter Seibold being injured. There are a lot of people who want to privatize space exploration, and they may feel that the entries on this list validate that opinion. But to them, we offer this sobering story. On October 31st, 2014, the fourth test flight of SpaceShipTwo was conducted by Michael Aylesbury, who'd flown it for previous tests, as well as his co-pilot, Peter Seibold. Aylesbury deployed the innovative tail system for the suborbital vehicle when it was flying at Mach 0.8, Mach 1 being the speed of sound here. He was supposed to have deployed it at Mach 1.4. As a result, the tail was bent and the pilots lost control of the vehicle. Seibold survived only because he was able to deploy his parachute as his seat ejected. The wreck was so violent that debris from SpaceShipTwo was spread over 5 miles of the Mojave Desert. Preventability? The National Transport Safety Board investigated this and decided that it was a combination of co-pilot error and a failure to fully disclose risks on the part of Scaled Composites, who'd built SpaceShipTwo for Virgin Galactic. Scaled Composites knew of the danger in initiating the tail system too early, but aside from a mention in an email and a PowerPoint presentation, hadn't done anything to impart it to Aylesbury. And yet, as we'll see later, it was neither the largest disaster in the development of Virgin Galactic's space program, nor the first. Number 7. NASA 901. Victims: Elliot C. and Charlie Bassett, with roughly a dozen people being injured. Most disasters related to space exploration occur during a launch or while re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. This one was much more mundane while not being any less tragic. Astronauts Elliot C. and Charlie Bassett were flying to Lambert Field in St. Louis, Missouri on February 28, 1966 for the launch of Gemini 9. The mission was to fly to an unmanned Agena vehicle in Earth's orbit and dock with it, meaning the mission would provide America's third spacewalk. C and Bassett, like their backup astronauts Gene Cernan and Tom Stafford, were flying in T-38 Talon jets. During the flight to the airbase, C performed an unusual flight maneuver during his descent, which cut off the backup pilots from descending and caused him to fly past his target. While attempting to correct, C crashed his jet into the roof of the McDonnell Building 101. Both astronauts were killed, with debris from the roof hitting about a dozen of the workers inside. Such was the violence of the accident that Bassett's head was discovered in the rafters of the building later that day. Nonetheless, the launch of Gemini 9, it went ahead as scheduled. Preventability. An investigation by NASA hypothesized that the accident was essentially the result of pilot error brought on by bad weather. C had flown in too low because he wanted to maintain visibility of the airfield on a foggy day. There was no coming to an absolute conclusion here because C had died before he could answer any questions. Number 6. The 2007 scaled Composites disaster. Victims Todd Ivins, Eric Blackwell, and Charles May, with 3 more being injured. Most victims of space disasters that the layperson can name are astronauts. However, the engineers and maintenance personnel are at high risk as well. And so it was on July 26, 2007 that engineers for Scaled Composites were testing the propellant flow system for SpaceShipTwo at Kern County at Mojave Airport, 95 miles outside of Los Angeles, California. A tank of nitrous oxide exploded with a force likened to a 500-pound bomb, striking 6 workers with debris. 3 were killed, 2 immediately. Preventability? Investigators certainly rated it as very high, considering that they found Scaled Composites guilty of 5 safety violations. For example, the engineers were performing the test with no more shielding than a chain-link fence. However, the fine the company faced was only $25,000. When the second SpaceShipTwo disaster occurred 7 years later, Todd Ivins' sister, Tara Ford, said of Virgin Galactic space program, "Don't let any more die." Number 5. The Apollo 1 fire. Victims Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee. It was supposed to be a routine pre-flight test. The fuel tanks for Apollo 1, as it was placed on the Saturn 1B pad, were left empty on January 27, 1967. Then, at 11:31 a.m., a fire broke out in the commands module. It was later determined that what doomed the 3 astronauts was that the command module hatch would only open inward. The air pressure inside from the sudden rise in temperature and release of gases was so high, more than 17 pounds per square inch, that it simply could not be opened until 5 minutes after the fire broke out, and by that point the astronauts had died from heat and smoke inhalation. So terrible was the conflagration that it was 7.5 hours before the bodies were removed. Preventability? The verdict of the 18-month investigation into the accident was that there had been a short circuit from in front of Gus Grissom's seat. NASA undertook extensive measures to ensure there would be no repeats of this accident. Naturally, the hatches were redesigned to open outwards, along with replacing any flammable components with fire suppressants. Number 4. Soyuz 11. Victims Georgy Dubrovsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev. Soyuz 11's mission was poised to be one of the great feats in astronomical history. Having docked with Salyut 1, the world's first space station, on June 7, 1971, their return on June 30th promised to set a new record for the longest time humans had endured staying in orbit. When their capsule landed in almost precisely the intended location, seemingly perfectly intact, it seemed like a hero's welcome was surely coming. The Soyuz crew had become media darlings, live footage of them on board the space station having become a TV show. When the capsule was opened, the recovery team found that the 3 men seemed to be unconscious. Their bodies were still warm, so CPR was attempted, but it was quickly revealed that they had been dead for several minutes. For a time, speculation swirls that perhaps their deaths proved that there were hard limits for how long humans could survive in zero gravity. To this day, the poor men are the only 3 that have died in space. Preventability? In the subsequent analysis, Vasily Mishin, the chief designer of the Soyuz 11, was the one who found that the capsule had been decompressed by the valve loosening during the detachment from Salyut 1. The crew had died of suffocation, having less than a minute to scramble for the valves. It was pointed out that if the crew had been provided spacesuits, they almost certainly would have survived. Number 3. Columbia STS-107. Victims Rick Husband, Michael Anderson, David Brown, Kalpana Chawla, Laurel Clark, William McCool, and Ian Ramone. One of the most recent disasters in this video is that of the Columbia STS-107, and it was the result of something that sounds rather trivial. During the launch from Kennedy Space Center on January 16, 2003, a piece of foam weighing 1.67 pounds broke off from one of the fuel tanks and fell on the left wing. This caused a leak of extremely hot gases that further cut through the wing. The extent of the damage was unsuspected until after the mission's various scientific experiments were completed and re-entry was attempted on February 1, 2003. There was only the paltry relief of knowing that the crew was reported to have lost consciousness after only a few seconds. NASA was unusually explicit in its 400-page report that was released in December of 2008 after more than 5 years of investigation. Nothing could be done by the crew to save themselves as soon as the damage was inflicted on the wing. The breakup of the crew module and the crew's subsequent exposure to hypersonic entry conditions was not survivable by any currently existing capability. Despite NASA's attempts to fix the process, on July 15, 2009, the launch of Shuttle Endeavour was jeopardized by nearly a dozen pieces of foam striking the underbelly of the shuttle, meaning the crew came perilously close to a repeat of Columbia's fate. The evidence points to this being a very difficult to avoid threat. Number 2. Plesetsk Cosmodrome. Victims: 45 killed instantly and 5 more died during rescue attempts. Plesetsk Cosmodrome is located roughly 500 miles north of Moscow, and in addition to still being Russia's largest spaceport today, in 1957 it became the first place that the Soviet Union placed intercontinental ballistic missiles. On March 19, 1980, the Vostok rocket was supposed to be launched with the intention of putting a spy satellite named Ikar into orbit. Instead, both the rocket and the entire launch pad were destroyed in a massive explosion that the Soviet newspaper Pravda attempted to cover up by claiming that the launch had been a success, and they didn't actually admit the truth until 1989. Preventability? There was some debate over what specifically caused the 300 tons of fuel to explode. The state report was that it had been caused by human error, with fuel being allowed to leak, but the Russian TV show Independent Investigation insisted during a broadcast in 2000 that it was a problem with the fuel filters. Whatever the truth, Independent Investigation was adamant that the safety of personnel was the least of their worries. The fact that there were no attempts to modernize the facility in the subsequent 20 years seems to bear that out. Under such circumstances, preventing tragedies like this seems very difficult indeed. Number 1. Intelsat 708. Victims: officially 6 dead and 57 personnel injured, but potentially hundreds of anonymous civilians. The role China has played in the space race remains relatively low profile in the West. The destruction of this Long March 3B rocket near the town of Xichang and the border of Vietnam on February 14, 1996 is one of the most prominent events, especially since there were such American witnesses as safety specialist Bruce Campbell. The launch to deliver the commercial satellite took place at 3 in the morning, and the shuttle was in the air for about 20 seconds as it arched towards the housing facilities for the launch personnel. Those buildings were empty because everyone was out watching the launch, but the explosion of the 426-ton rocket leveled numerous surrounding buildings as well. A local monument to ancient Chinese rocketry history was also destroyed. Preventability? The cause of the disaster was determined to be a problem with the welding and flight control system. The American contractors claimed that safety at the launch facility was lax. Yet the only known entity to receive official punishment was the US satellite company Loral Space and Communications, which was fined $14 million by the US government in 2002 for sharing confidential information with the Chinese government that allowed the government to determine the nature of the problem. The position of the Chinese government seemed to be to downplay the tragedy as much as possible. Campbell claimed that he visited the site of the village later and found that it had been cleared not only of any sign of the crash, but of any village whatsoever. In official statements, the government claimed that the village had been evacuated before the launch, but that was directly contradicted by Campbell's recollection of seeing many villagers leaving the crash site in the aftermath, and others who claimed to see pickup truck beds filled with corpses. And it's here that we feel we should point out that actively trying to forget the past is a pretty great way of repeating it. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. And if you're looking for another channel where I do daily videos, please do check out Today I Found Out. You'll find a link to that below. And as always, thank you for watching.